When we think of the Middle Ages, our minds often conjure images of glittering knights in armor, majestic castles rising against the horizon, and noble lords dining in vast halls lit by golden candlelight. We imagine troubadours singing of love, monks writing sacred texts, and kings commanding armies with banners streaming in the wind. Yet behind this romantic image lies a darker, grittier truth. The medieval world was held together not by glory, but by toil. And for many, that toil was not only hard, it was filthy, degrading, and dangerous beyond belief. The backbone of medieval society was not the sword, but the shovel, not the king's crown, but the calloused hands of men and women whose jobs condemned them to lives of stench, blood, and fear. Their work rarely entered the pages of chronicles or the songs of poets. But without them, castles would have rotted, towns would have drowned in their own filth, and armies would have starved before they ever reached the battlefield. These were the forgotten laborers, the ones who bore the weight of medieval life so that others might live in comfort. Imagine, for a moment, the streets of a medieval town. Beneath the timbered houses and bustling markets lies a cesspit brimming with waste, its foul odor seeping through cracks in the stone. Someone had to climb down there, shovel in hand, scraping and hauling away the filth by night so that the city would not choke on its own refuse. That man was the gong farmer, whose work was vital, but whose very presence was considered unclean. Picture the marshes and ponds where barefoot men and women waded, their legs crawling with leeches, blood dripping from 100 tiny wounds. These were leech collectors, supplying medieval doctors with their favorite cure for nearly every ailment, bloodletting. Their labor, performed in silence and mud, fed the medical theories of the age, though it left their own bodies weak and scarred. Or turn your gaze to the tanneries, where piles of animal hides rotted in pits of lime and dung. Workers there lived surrounded by the stench of decay, their skin burned raw by caustic chemicals, their lungs choked by noxious fumes. No knight would ride into battle without leather straps and armor softened by these men's toil. Yet few would ever stand close to a tanner, whose smell clung like a curse. The medieval world was built on contrasts. The same society that raised soaring cathedrals also forced men to wade in filth. The same people who wrote chants of heavenly beauty also scraped rotting hides for leather. For every noble who sat at a feast, dozens of invisible hands labored in kitchens, laundries, and stables, their sweat staining the bread and meat that graced the Lord's table. These jobs were not glamorous, nor were they safe. They carried risks of disease, injury, and social rejection. To be an executioner meant wielding the sword of justice, but it also meant living in shame, shunned even by those who relied on your work. To be a gravedigger during the Black Death was to bury hundreds, sometimes thousands, with your own hands, knowing that each body might be your own death sentence. To be a servant was to work endlessly for scraps, your name forgotten even before your body was laid in the earth. And yet, without these laborers, the great machine of medieval life would have collapsed. Their misery ensured survival. Their suffering was the silent engine of the Middle Ages. Knights may have won glory on the battlefield, kings may have commanded empires, and priests may have preached of heaven and hell. But it was the gong farmer, the leech collector, the tanner, the grave digger, and countless others whose work kept the world alive. This is their story, the tale of the worst jobs in the Middle Ages. It is a story not of romance, but of reality, not of glory, but of grit. Through their lives, we glimpse the true foundations of medieval society, not built of marble and gold, but of blood, sweat, filth, and forgotten hands. If there was ever a job that defined the word disgusting in the Middle Ages, it was the life of the gong farmer. The title itself carried irony. Gong was an Old English word for dung, and farmer suggested a cultivator of land. Yet these men did not harvest crops. They harvested human waste. Their work was hidden in the shadows, carried out in silence and stench. Yet without them, medieval towns and cities would have drowned in their own filth. In an age before modern sewage systems, human waste was collected in cesspits beneath houses or communal latrines. These pits could stretch deep into the ground, filling slowly over years until they overflowed into streets and water sources. The danger was obvious. Foul odors carried disease, and contaminated water could spark outbreaks of dysentery, cholera, or worse. To prevent this, someone had to climb into the darkness and scoop the filth out by hand. That someone was the gong farmer. The work was usually done at night, under the cover of darkness, so as not to offend the senses of the public. Armed with shovels, buckets, and sheer endurance, gong farmers descended into pits where the air was thick, choking, and sometimes deadly. Accounts tell of men fainting from the fumes, suffocating in the very waste they sought to clear. Others carried lanterns, but open flames in methane-filled pits could be as dangerous as the muck itself. To be a gong farmer was not only disgusting, it was perilous. And yet their work was indispensable. The waste they removed was not always discarded. In some cases, it was carted away and sold as fertilizer to farmers, closing the grim circle of sustenance in medieval life. Thus, even dung had its market value. But for the men who waded waist-deep in cesspits, that silver lining hardly sweetened their toil. They were well paid compared to other laborers, often earning more than a skilled craftsman, yet the price was their reputation and health. Socially, gong farmers were pariahs. The stench clung to their bodies no matter how much they washed, and neighbors avoided them in public. They were often forced to live on the edges of towns, away from respectable folk. Marriage prospects were slim, friendships rare. Children of gong farmers inherited not only the trade, but the stigma. For all their service to society, they were marked as unclean, living reminders of the filth others wished to forget. Still, there were strange advantages. Because of the hazards and the isolation, gong farmers often formed close-knit groups, bound by shared hardship. They were sometimes granted legal protections, allowed to carry out their work without interference, for no one else would dare step into their role. In some places, laws forbade them from working during daylight hours, not to protect them, but to shield the public from the sight and smell of their labor. It is easy to mock such a profession, to recoil at the thought of it. Yet without gong farmers, medieval cities would have been unlivable. Their unseen toil kept diseases at bay. Their filthy buckets preserved the very health of those who shunned them. In a paradox almost cruel, these men were both despised and indispensable, cursed yet necessary. The nobility might have worn velvet, the clergy might have preached purity, but their comfort and health were secured by men ankle-deep in waste, shoveling in silence. The gong farmer stands as a symbol of the medieval truth, that behind every display of grandeur, there were those condemned to labor in filth. They remind us that civilization, in any age, rests not only on kings and knights, but on the invisible hands willing to do the dirtiest work. In the Middle Ages, no one bore that burden more heavily than the men who mastered medieval filth. If the gong farmer's world was the stench of the city, the leech collector's world was the damp silence of the marsh. These men and women ventured into swamps, ponds, and bogs armed with little more than a bucket and a grim resolve. Their task was simple in theory, but brutal in practice. to gather leeches, the writhing parasites prized by medieval medicine. Doctors demanded them in endless numbers, for bloodletting was considered the cure to almost every ailment, from fevers to headaches, even to melancholy of the soul. And so the leech collector waded out, offering their own flesh as bait. Collectors often worked barefoot, or with legs bare to the knee, stepping slowly through the mud and water. The leeches sensed warmth and movement, clinging eagerly to exposed skin. Within minutes, dozens might fasten themselves, their mouths slicing the skin with razor-sharp jaws, their saliva preventing blood from clotting. The collector would emerge from the water with legs streaked in red, the leeches dangling and gorging until full. The pain was sharp but tolerable. The danger lay in blood loss and infection. Too many bites could weaken a person, leaving them dizzy, feverish, or worse. To remove the creatures, collectors scraped them into buckets, storing them in damp cloths or jars for transport. A full day's work meant repeated trips into the water, repeated wounds, repeated risks. Some grew so accustomed to the sensation of leeches feeding that they worked almost mechanically, as if the pain no longer registered. Others bore permanent scars on their legs, dark rings where the leeches had feasted again and again. Payment for this misery was pitiful. A handful of coins for hours in cold water, enough perhaps to buy bread or fuel, but rarely enough to lift a family out of poverty. And yet the demand never ceased. Physicians and barbers, those amateur surgeons of the Middle Ages, relied on leeches as their most essential tool. Entire households might be drained in attempts to balance the body's humors. It was said that kings and nobles endured bleeding as often as peasants, for sickness spared no one. And in every case, the leech collector's work was indispensable. But indispensable did not mean respected. Like gong farmers and tanners, leech collectors carried a social stain. Their work was seen as crude, associated with filth and blood, far from the noble crafts of guilds or the honored labor of farmers. They were tolerated because they were useful, but little more. Children mocked them, neighbors avoided them, and even physicians who relied on their trade treated them as expendable suppliers rather than partners in healing. Still, their work carried strange prestige in times of crisis. During outbreaks of fever or plague, when fear drove people to desperate measures, leech collectors found themselves in sudden demand. Their buckets, brimming with writhing life, became grim treasures. To some, they appeared almost magical. Men and women who walked into swamps and returned with creatures that could draw sickness from the body. In superstition as much as medicine, they became necessary links between man and nature, between sickness and cure. And so the leech collector endured, half healer, half victim, always expendable. Their world was mud and blood, their companions worms of the marsh, their reward barely enough to survive. They remind us that medieval medicine, for all its learning, rested on the raw pain of those who supplied its tools. Doctors wore robes and spoke of Aristotle and Galen, but their cures depended on peasants knee-deep in swamp water, letting their lifeblood drip into the mud. In the end, the leech collector's story is not only one of misery, but of paradox. They bled so that others might heal, suffered weakness so that others might be strengthened. Their worst job was, in its own strange way, an act of service, thankless, painful, and hidden, but essential to the machinery of medieval life. If the leech collector's misery was blood and mud, the fuller's world was no less foul, defined by endless labor, soaked in stench, and bound to the cloth that clothed medieval society. Wool was the lifeblood of Europe's economy. From the humblest peasant's cloak to the rich tapestries adorning a noble's hall, wool was everywhere. But raw wool straight from the sheep was greasy, loose, and useless for fine garments. To make it strong and wearable, it had to be fulled. And for that, the fuller stepped forward into vats of filth. The process of fulling was both simple and revolting. Cloth was submerged in a mixture that helped clean and thicken the fibers. In earlier centuries, the primary ingredient was human urine. Its ammonia acted as a cleansing agent, stripping the wool of its greasy lanolin and tightening the weave. Fullers would stomp upon the cloth barefoot or with wooden shoes, pounding it again and again in vats brimming with stale urine collected from chamber pots. Day after day, hour after hour. Their legs splashed in liquid that clung to their skin and soaked their clothes. The smell was indescribable, sharp, acrid, clinging. Whole streets near fulleries reeked of it, the stench carrying far beyond their walls. Even when technological advances introduced water-powered fulling mills in some regions, where wooden hammers pounded the cloth, urine and other foul substances, such as clay or soap, were still part of the process. Fullers were not spared the odor, nor the disdain that came with it. Their profession stained not only their hands and garments, but their very reputation. The labor itself was exhausting. Stomping and beating wool for hours at a time was back-breaking work, leaving legs swollen, muscles aching, and joints worn. The fumes irritated lungs and eyes, sometimes causing long-term health problems. Yet, despite the misery, the demand never waned. Every garment, every bolt of cloth that passed through markets, monasteries, and manors relied on the fullers' unending toil. Without them, Europe would have gone unclothed. Payment for this drudgery was meager. Fullers often worked within guild structures in towns, but theirs was considered one of the lowest crafts, a rung above outright filth handlers, but far beneath the weavers and dyers who transformed cloth into finished goods. Their labor was essential, yet they lived at the margins, their bodies marked by the odors of their trade. They could not escape their work. The smell followed them everywhere, making them easy to spot and easier to avoid. Yet paradoxically, fullers held power in numbers. In cloth-producing regions like Flanders and England, where wool was wealth, fullers organized strikes and protests when mistreated. Though despised for their stench, they could cripple local economies by refusing to work. In this, they remind us that even the most reviled jobs could become crucial levers of influence in a world built upon their labor. For the fuller, there was no romance, no admiration. There was only the endless rhythm of stomping, the choking fumes, and the faint reward of wages just enough to eat. They lived in the shadows of the textile industry that brought Europe prestige and profit, faceless laborers beaten down by the very cloth they prepared. And yet, when nobles donned their fine cloaks, when bishops paraded in splendid vestments, when kings draped themselves in wool lined with fur, all carried upon their backs the hidden sweat of the fuller. Every robe of dignity began its life in filth. The irony was bitter. Those who worked ankle-deep in urine clothed those who scorned them. Their labor dressed Europe, but their names were never remembered. Thus, the fuller's job stands as one of the worst of the Middle Ages, not because it was unnecessary, but because it was unavoidable, thankless, and degrading. To wear beauty, someone had to endure filth. That someone was the fuller. If fullers lived in the stink of cloth, tanners were drowned in the rot of flesh. Leather was indispensable in the Middle Ages. Shoes, belts, saddles, armor, bookbindings, society itself was strapped together by leather. But to transform raw animal hides into something usable required one of the foulest, most dangerous jobs imaginable. It demanded hands willing to handle decay, lungs tough enough to breathe poison, and bodies hardened to endure a stench that clung to the soul. The process began with freshly skinned hides, still greasy, often bloody, sometimes crawling with maggots if left too long in the sun. The hides had to be stripped of every last scrap of flesh and fat. Workers took knives to the slippery surfaces, scraping with endless strokes until their arms ached. Then came the soaking. The skins were plunged into pits filled with lime to loosen the hair, their fumes burning eyes and lungs. Days later, the tanners hauled them out, slippery and swollen, to scrape again, peeling away hair and flesh until the hide was clean. But the worst was yet to come. To soften the stiff skins, they were soaked in solutions of animal dung and rotting matter. Some mixtures even called for dog excrement, others for pigeon droppings, their enzymes working to break down the fibers. Workers, often apprentices and the poorest of the poor, waded into these pits barefoot, stomping hides in the slurry for hours. The stench was overwhelming. A reek of ammonia and decay so strong that entire districts of towns were avoided if tanneries operated there. The people who lived nearby spoke of the smell clinging to clothes, hair, even food. Tanners themselves bore the mark of their profession wherever they went. Their hands were stained, their clothes permanently fouled, their bodies carrying an odor that soap and water could never wash away. Like gong farmers, they were often forced to live apart from respectable citizens, on the outskirts of towns, near rivers whose waters they polluted daily. No noble would stand near a tanner if he could help it, yet every noble depended on the leather their misery produced. The dangers were not only social, but physical. The lime used to strip hides could burn skin raw. The fumes of ammonia scarred lungs. Cuts on the hands, inevitable when working with sharp knives, could quickly become infected when plunged back into vats of filth. Many tanners lived shortened lives, their bodies broken by the very materials they transformed. Yet their wages were modest at best, barely above survival. They were too essential to be ignored, too foul to be respected. Ironically, despite their stigma, tanners were powerful in one sense. Their work was impossible to replace. Every army needed saddles, shields, belts, and boots. Every household needed leather for straps, pouches, and shoes. Monks copied sacred texts onto vellum, a fine leather made from calfskin. Kings signed charters on parchment, also the product of this craft. In every corner of medieval life, tanners were present, even if hidden, despised, and shunned. Some towns tried to control them with strict regulations, confining their work to distant quarters, forcing them to dump waste downstream. Others taxed them heavily, profiting from their necessity while scorning their presence. In guild structures, tanners were often ranked low, beneath cloth workers or metal smiths, their trade considered one of dishonor despite its vital role. The irony of the tanner's life is inescapable. They were reviled for the smell of their work, yet the world was bound together by their leather. They were shunned in public, yet their products walked with kings. They labored in death and decay so that others could stride in comfort, fight in armor, and read holy scripture. They lived surrounded by filth, but their work was the foundation of civilization. In the long list of medieval misery, few jobs capture the paradox more clearly than the tanners. Indispensable, yet untouchable. They lived in the shadow of their own trade, breathing in rot, wading in dung, scraping hides until their bodies broke. And when they died, their names passed quietly, remembered not as men but as the stench that lingered long after them. If the tanner lived in a world of rot, the rat-catcher lived in a world of fear. Rats were not just vermin in the Middle Ages. They were symbols of chaos, carriers of destruction, harbingers of plague. To see them scurrying across the floor was to feel dread crawl across the skin. And yet, where there was fear, there was also necessity. Someone had to hunt them, trap them, kill them, and remove their corpses before they spread further ruin. That someone was the rat catcher, a figure who walked the line between savior and outcast. Rat catchers were armed with whatever tools the age offered: traps of wood and iron, nets, dogs trained to sniff out nests, even cats carried on leashes to release into infested homes. Many relied on their own cunning, stalking the vermin in alleys, granaries, and kitchens. But the work was never clean. Rats fought back with sharp teeth, spreading bites that festered into infection. The fleas that lived on their backs leapt onto the catchers, biting, burrowing, sometimes carrying with them the invisible terror of plague. To be a rat catcher was to stand daily at death's threshold. The Black Death of the 14th century elevated their work to grim prominence. Panic spread faster than the pestilence itself. Villagers looked to rat catchers as desperate guardians against the creeping horror. Yet the irony was cruel. The very act of handling rats and their fleas placed the catcher among the most exposed of all. Some became plague victims themselves, collapsing after weeks of wading through nests of vermin, their bodies covered in bites, their lungs filling with death. Others survived, hardened by exposure, whispered about as if immune to the plague's curse. Socially, rat catchers were ambivalent figures. On the one hand, they were sought out, even thanked, when infestations threatened food stores or when the specter of plague loomed. On the other, they were often shunned, seen as unclean, tainted by their constant contact with filth and disease. Like the gong farmer and the tanner, the rat catcher bore the scent of their profession into every space, invisible yet undeniable. Few would dine beside them. Fewer still would marry them. Rat catchers often carried their grim trophies to prove their worth: bags of dead vermin, tails strung together, carcasses displayed as warnings. Some towns paid them bounties per rat tail, rewarding their kills with coins. Others treated them with suspicion, fearing that the same man who killed rats might also release them, inflating the problem to secure more work. In this, the rat catcher became not only a necessary servant, but a figure of unease, half protector, half potential deceiver. Legends grew around their trade. The most famous is that of the Pied Piper of Hamelin, a story of a rat catcher who, after ridding the town of vermin, turned his wrath on the townsfolk's children when they refused to pay his fee. Whether myth or allegory, the tale captures the paradox: the rat catcher as both savior and sinister, trusted and feared, vital and dangerous. In quieter times, rat catchers also dealt with mice, weasels, and other vermin, protecting granaries and harvests from ruin. Their dogs barked in barns, their traps snapped in pantries, their presence a silent reassurance that order could be restored against nature's creeping tide. Yet their reward was always meager, their respect always conditional. They were never celebrated in chronicles or praised in poems, only tolerated when terror made their services indispensable. The rat catcher's life was thus lived in shadow, chasing vermin through filth, carrying disease on his skin, forever balanced between gratitude and revulsion. He reminds us that in the Middle Ages, fear was not just of God or kings, but of nature itself, and that survival often depended on those willing to confront that fear daily. His was a worst job, not because it lacked importance, but because it carried with it the constant shadow of death, unseen yet always near. Among the worst jobs of the Middle Ages, none carried such a mixture of fear, power, and isolation as that of the executioner. To the townsfolk, he was both terrifying and necessary, the hand of justice, the wielder of the blade, the one who stood between order and chaos. Yet behind this grim authority lay a life of loneliness, shame, and perpetual suspicion. The executioner was a man who lived in society's center when summoned, and on its edge the rest of the time. His duties were many and rarely merciful. He swung the sword in beheadings, tightened ropes at gallows, oversaw burnings, brandings, and floggings. In some regions, he even maimed criminals, cutting off ears, hands, or noses as punishment. Each act was carried out publicly, for executions were spectacles meant to terrify crowds into obedience. When the executioner stepped forward, the marketplace fell silent, all eyes fixed on the man who would, with a single stroke, decide another's fate. His presence embodied the law's finality, its cold, merciless edge. But though he carried authority, he carried no honor. Most people recoiled from him, treating him as tainted by the blood he spilled. To shake his hand, to share his table, to live beside him, these were acts few dared. He was often forced to dwell outside city walls, his house marked so that none could mistake it. Children whispered his name in fear, merchants crossed the street to avoid him. Priests sometimes hesitated to grant him sacraments. He was a paradox, necessary, yet despised. This isolation extended even into family life. Executioners' children inherited the stigma, struggling to find spouses, often pushed into the same profession by lack of choice. Some executioners came from families who had borne the role for generations, each son inheriting the sword like a cursed legacy. Others were criminals spared death on the condition they serve the community as its hangman, a bitter exchange of one form of doom for another. The job itself carried its own torment. A swift, clean beheading could win a grudging respect, but a botched one, several strokes required to sever a head, brought jeers, stones, and sometimes violence from the crowd. Burnings at the stake tested not only the condemned, but also the executioner, who had to endure the screams, the smell of charred flesh, the sight of human agony prolonged by fire. These memories lingered, haunting the men long after the crowds had dispersed. And yet, for all the horror, there were privileges. Executioners were sometimes granted the right to claim the belongings of the condemned, a grim form of payment that included clothes, shoes, or tools. They might also enjoy certain protections under law, immune from punishment for acts performed in duty. In some places, they even had exclusive rights to sell certain goods, like hides from slaughtered animals, or to operate specific businesses. These perks softened the hardship but could never erase the stigma. Legends tell of executioners who drank heavily to dull their memories, who walked the line between feared enforcer and broken man. Some became dark figures in folklore, seen as half-demons who thrived on blood. Others, however, were known to show mercy, swift strikes, quiet prayers, final drinks offered to the condemned. In those moments, the executioner revealed himself not only as an agent of justice, but as a man who bore the burden of cruelty so others would not. The executioner's life is a stark reminder of the brutal machinery of medieval justice. He embodied the law's most terrifying face, ensuring obedience through fear, yet he himself was trapped in a cage of isolation built by the very society he served. His was a job of paradox, power without honor, necessity without respect, duty without escape. Truly, it was among the worst of the Middle Ages, not only for the blood spilled, but for the life forever lived in its shadow. If the executioner stood at the public stage of death, the gravedigger labored in its silent aftermath. His work carried no spectacle, no crowd, no ritual grandeur, only the ceaseless rhythm of shovel and earth. In the Middle Ages, where life was precarious and death a constant visitor, the gravedigger's role was both essential and unrelenting. He was the man who laid the dead to rest, not with prayers or blessings, but with sweat, mud, and aching muscles. In ordinary times, the gravedigger's life was already grim. Parish records show steady deaths from childbirth, fevers, accidents, and famine. Each body required a grave dug by hand, often in hard or stony soil. The labor was back-breaking, hours of digging under sun or frost, the earth resisting every thrust of the spade. For this work, the gravedigger received little pay, barely enough to survive. His reward was not respect, for he lived at the margins, tainted by his intimacy with the dead. People believed the smell of the grave clung to him, that he carried with him the shadow of death itself. But when plague came, his life turned into a waking nightmare. During the Black Death, death carts rolled endlessly through the streets, piled high with bodies. Bells tolled without pause. Priests collapsed from exhaustion, unable to bury the dead with proper rites. It was then that the gravedigger became one of the most important figures in Europe. With his shovel, he fought a losing battle against the tide of death, digging trenches wide enough to swallow dozens, sometimes hundreds, of corpses at once. Accounts from the time tell of men collapsing beside the pits they dug, their lungs failing from the pestilence, their bodies joining the very dead they sought to bury. Others worked masked with herbs stuffed into their noses, or with scarves soaked in vinegar, desperate to ward off the invisible corruption. Still, the work continued. For if the dead were left unburied, the stench alone could overwhelm towns, and fear of disease spread faster than the plague itself. The gravedigger's toil became an act of desperate containment, a fragile barrier between the living and the dead. Psychologically, the burden was immense. Imagine lowering neighbors, friends, even family into the earth by the dozens, day after day. Imagine standing at the edge of a trench filled with lifeless faces, knowing you might soon lie among them. Gravediggers lived with despair as their constant companion. Some turned to drink, others to silence, their eyes hollow from sights that no man should endure. And yet without them, society would have drowned in corpses, stripped not only of life but of dignity in death. Superstition surrounded them as well. Some whispered that gravediggers were immune to plague, protected by their morbid duty. Others claimed they were cursed, destined for damnation because they handled the unclean. In truth, many gravediggers died young, their bodies worn by toil and their lungs by pestilence. But those who survived long enough became ghostly figures in their communities, men half feared, half pitied, lingering reminders of the thin line between life and the grave. Even in times without pestilence, their isolation endured. Few would invite a gravedigger to a feast or share a drink with him at the tavern. He lived close to the cemetery, often in a hut or shack, his world bounded by tombstones and fresh-dug earth. Children avoided his path. Lovers crossed themselves if they saw him. And yet, when death visited their homes, all called for him. In his hands lay the final act of mercy that every human life required: a grave. Thus, the gravedigger's story is one of silent heroism and crushing misery. His was a worst job not for its lack of meaning, but for its endless reminder of mortality. He lived surrounded by death, working tirelessly to preserve dignity for others while losing his own place in society. In his shadow, medieval life reveals its raw truth. Every prayer, every feast, every act of glory eventually ended in his shovel's work. And in that final act, the gravedigger stood as the keeper of the dead, forgotten by the living. If the gravedigger wrestled with death itself, the servant class wrestled with the relentless grind of life. Castles and manors may conjure visions of feasts, tapestries, and noble splendor, but beneath the glitter of the great hall was a hidden army of servants, toiling endlessly so that their lords could live in ease. Their labor rarely drew notice, for it was designed to be invisible, seamless, and uncelebrated. Yet, without them, the medieval household, the very heart of aristocratic life, would have collapsed into chaos. Consider the kitchen boy, rising before dawn to stoke fires, haul water, and scrub pots blackened with soot. He worked under the cook's stern eye, darting between spits heavy with meat, risking burns from open flames and slips on greasy floors. His day stretched long past the Lord's feast, for when nobles retired, the servants remained to clean bones from the rushes, scrub benches, and prepare for the next day's hunger. His life was a cycle of smoke, sweat, and exhaustion, his name forgotten the moment he dropped from weariness. The laundress endured an equally thankless burden. Clothes in the Middle Ages were precious, often worn for weeks before washing, stained with sweat, mud, and worse. To cleanse them, laundresses hauled heavy buckets to rivers or troughs, kneeling for hours with raw hands plunged into icy water. They beat garments against stones, rubbed them with lye soap that cracked the skin, then hung them to dry in smoky air. The smell of washing clung to them always, and though their work preserved the dignity of their masters, their own dignity was ground away by endless toil. In the stables, grooms and stable boys waded through straw soaked with urine, their hands chapped from brushing horses and hauling hay. They tended animals through frost and rain, rising in the dark to feed them, sleeping often beside their charges to keep them warm. When lords rode forth to war or hunting, their steeds gleamed with care that only unseen hands had provided. Yet the grooms themselves were invisible, remembered only when a horse stumbled or a saddle slipped. And then there were the scullions, the lowest of the low, children or orphans taken into service with no choice of their own. Their tasks were the dirtiest, scraping scraps from plates, scrubbing chamber pots, sweeping rushes layered with grease and vermin. They slept on floors, ate what little remained after others had finished, and endured beatings for the smallest mistakes. Many grew up broken in body and spirit, their entire existence consumed in servitude. For women servants, the burdens were doubled. Maids not only cleaned, but also endured the constant threat of exploitation, their lives at the mercy of masters who held absolute authority. Some bore children unacknowledged, their shame hidden in whispers. Others aged early, their bodies bent from labor, discarded once they could no longer serve. Their lives were silent tragedies, woven into the fabric of households that prided themselves on honor and nobility. Servants lived on the edge of visibility. At feasts, they stood in the shadows, ready to pour wine, carry platters, or rush forward with napkins. They heard secrets in the night, the arguments of lords, the whispers of ladies, yet could never speak. To reveal what they knew was to risk punishment or worse. Their invisibility was both their burden and their shield, a life spent in the background, erased even as it unfolded. And yet their work was indispensable. Without servants, the castles would have grown filthy, the noble tables bare, the horses weak, the beds unmade. The grandeur of the Middle Ages rested upon their unseen shoulders. They lived in silence so that others might live in song. They labored in shadows so that others might shine in light. The servant class represents the cruel paradox of medieval society. They were the foundation of noble life, yet treated as though they were nothing. Their jobs were among the worst not for their filth or danger alone, but for their invisibility, for the fact that they could give their entire lives in service and pass into death unnamed, unremembered, unvalued. When we remember the Middle Ages, we often think first of kings crowned in cathedrals, knights charging across battlefields, or monks illuminating sacred texts by candlelight. Yet beneath this glittering surface, hidden in shadows and stench, labored the men and women who bore the true weight of medieval society. Their hands dug the graves, cleaned the filth, scraped the hides, and washed the garments. Their lives were lived in misery, their names forgotten, but without them the medieval world would have collapsed into chaos. The gong farmer kept the cities livable, hauling away the waste that would otherwise have drowned towns in disease. The leech collector fed the insatiable hunger of medieval medicine, offering his own blood to supply the doctor's jars. The fuller stomped endlessly in urine-soaked vats, giving strength to the wool that clothed Europe. The tanner endured rot and poison to create the leather that bound books, armored knights, and carried kings. The rat-catcher hunted vermin in alleys and granaries, walking always with the shadow of plague. The executioner stood as the embodiment of justice, wielding terror even as he was cursed by society. The gravedigger buried the endless dead, especially when pestilence turned the world into a charnel house. The servants, kitchen boys, laundresses, grooms, and scullions labored in silence, the unseen engines of every castle and manor. Each of these lives was marked by paradox. They were despised yet indispensable, shunned yet summoned, cursed yet relied upon. Society turned its face away from them, recoiling at their stench or their shame, yet could not survive a day without their toil. These jobs were the true foundation of the Middle Ages, though they are seldom sung in chronicles or celebrated in legend. Their absence would have brought collapse. Their presence ensured continuity. And what of the human cost? Their bodies broke early from labor. Their skin bore scars, burns, and sores. Their lungs filled with fumes, their hands with calluses. Many died young, worn out before their time, their graves as unremarkable as their lives. Others endured into old age, marked always by the stench of their trade, their children inheriting not only poverty but stigma. If knights bore swords and kings bore crowns, these workers bore silence, an invisible burden heavier than iron. Yet there is something in their stories that demands recognition, for in their misery lies a kind of endurance, even a kind of dignity. To climb into cesspits, to wade in plague, to dig the graves of thousands, to work until hands bled and bodies bent. That was survival, and it was service. These forgotten laborers did not choose glory, but necessity. They did not command armies or inspire poems, yet they built the foundations on which those armies and poets stood. In truth, the worst jobs of the Middle Ages reveal more about that world than the best ones. Knights and nobles may have embodied ideals, but gong farmers and laundresses embodied reality. Their lives strip away the illusions of romance and remind us that civilization is not made only by the shining few, but by the countless many who toil unseen. The cathedral's bells rang because someone hauled the stones. The feast was served because someone scraped the pots. The king's charter was signed on parchment made by hands that reeked of rot. So when we think of the Middle Ages, let us not only see the shining armor and the stained glass, but also the filth-stained tunics of the forgotten workers. For though they lived in silence, they held the world together. Their misery was the price of survival, their labor the heartbeat of a society that scarcely acknowledged them. They were, in truth, the backbone of the Middle Ages, unseen, uncelebrated, but absolutely essential. And perhaps, in remembering them now, we restore a fragment of the dignity denied them then.